galaxy, whereas most of them look fairly plausible terrestrial, and there was kind of this power law distribution of those.
So here's, once we really got our atmosphere shader working and we got the terrain shader working, this is just what the game looks like now, more or less. Yeah, and just a quick tour of some randomly generated planets. We've got a batch process that runs every night and generates 100 or 200,000 planets just to test the script, see if, are they all generating fast enough, are any of them causing problems for us. One of the things we have to worry about is once you get out from the planet, you've got this giant universe of stuff to explore with black holes and planetary nebula and gas giants and stuff like that. So this is a collection of Hubble Space Telescope photographs of kind of interesting things in the universe. And we thought, well, we have to match at least some of these. And we've got, again, this scriptable system, the same one that we're using to sculpt planets and the same one that we're using to paint creatures that we use to script kind of the inhabitants of the galactic zoo. And so one of our artists, Kate Compton, did these little effects, and each one of these is a little text script effect to represent planetary nebulas and
yeah, so these are the Hubble photos, and these are basically from in-game. Our attempts to recreate a lot of this kind of zoo of things that you find out in interstellar space.
There was a big question here about sort of how scientific and realistic should this be, and how cute and playful and colorful should it be, and that was a lot of sort of back and forth on that. Like it doesn't.
In fact, in the entire game, we kind of start from a more cartoony at the cell level. Less realistic, more cute, and working up to the space, it gets more progressively realistic. You can see these images reflect that.
We have to deal with a giant galaxy with 100 million stars in it and planets around each of them, and it's just hard to get something that doesn't look realistic. Once you get to that scale, and obviously we popped up the colors and made stuff sort of more vivid than it would be, but we just sort of shied away from giant bouncing happy planets.
Big don't have eyes.
But the cells do.
The cells do, exactly.
Okay. So this is kind of in-game right now. All these things kind of add up together. Now, next person I want to introduce you to is Chaim, who I brought on very early doing prototyping for the game, a lot of the kind of core gameplay. But also, when he joined the team, I put him full-time in charge of the editors, which is a huge part of Spore, as well as the cell game. And he's also looking at unification of like UI and stuff across the game. But really, between these things, the editors, the prototypes, there's a very kinesthetic sense to all this. The player's touching this, and we want these things to feel like toys. And that was a big challenge for us, is how to make the editors, not feel like work, but feel like something that you kind of understand. And a lot of games, there's an underlying metaphor. And people play The Sims, they kind of understand it as a dollhouse, they play Quake, it kind of feels like cowboys and Indians. And discovering kind of the underlying metaphor for what you're working on is a tremendous help in kind of conveying to the player an existing framework in which to understand something. So I'm going to have Chaim come up here and first talk a little bit about the editors, but then show you some of his prototypes that he did early on in the project.
So one of the things we have to do in making the editors is we're trying to find like that toy-like quality, like what makes something fun to touch and play with, like kinesthetically fun to touch, and a lot of it is sort of finding sort of like how an artist does something. So for example, here's Ocean's diagram of a limb. Find out how an artist does something, like reverse engineer their process, and then figure out how to put it into a toy so the player sort of has all that knowledge in something they can touch and is tactile. One of the challenges we had was figuring out where to put like all the creature parts. How would we take all of this content and structure in a way that the player would find accessible and would unlock in the game. Here's some cells in a family tree. So one of the things we found is that with all of this content that the art team made, we had to it had to be structured in a certain way so the player could parse it. So putting things into rows, that went like level 1, 2, 3, 4, so that you could sort of look at a glance, figure out what the pattern was in this content when you're browsing it, kind of like getting a view of a map from far away and also up close.
So Ocean was making this huge diversity of like parts that we build creatures, vehicles, whatever. But there had to be basically some taxonomy through which we were organizing these parts so the player could understand, okay, this is a carnivorous mouth and that's an herbivore, and this is a better mouth than that one. And so we had to come apply some topology to these things.
This was one of Will's creatures. Like I said, art directing, $1 million incompetence. Like I was
I think one of our other challenges with that, we've been debating a long time with the editor, it comes down to the editors, is how to make a creature evolve to look intelligent. What makes a creature look like something that you are meant to ride on, like a horse, versus something that's an intelligent creature. So we've tried to address that in some of the editors, but it's an ongoing problem to identify when you go and fly down to a planet's surface, which of the creatures that you're looking at is the intelligent one.
I think it's hats.
We've decided it's hats. So,
Jenna was concerned. You were convinced he was standing upright. That only bipeds were intelligent.
For a while, I tried to argue that if we procedurally moved their head to be the highest thing on their body as we came into the tribe game, then that would be interesting. I lost that battle. But it was my Pluto versus Goofy argument. Like, one of them you identify as a pet, and one of them is a peer of Mickey. And how do you well, one's wearing clothes.
One has a hat.
The Pluto versus Goofy argument. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to explain what you're seeing here.
So this was an early prototype about sort of like, thinking about the editors in terms of blocks. You saw like Ocean's prototype about like sort of the morphing blocks, like each one is this magical piece of Lego. And one of the challenges of designing the editors as toys is figuring out like, well, how do we put intelligence in the sort of the system that composes them, that sort of represents what an artist might do.
And for almost each one of our editors, we did 2D prototyping, tried to abstract out the problem into 3 dimensions, but basically solved it in the 2-dimensional case first.
So here's like an early creature editor. It's like, think about, the creature as being this, hierarchical structure where you can attach limbs to it, and then they sort of move like these toys.
So we went through probably 10 or 15 different metaphors for how the player would think about the editor and how these parts would relate and connect to each other.
One of my favorite ones is this one, where like we're trying to figure out like what makes whenever all the creatures I was seeing that like our artists on our team were making all had certain patterns to them, right? Like there was something about them that made them look cute, made them look good. And so what I did is spent like a long time trying to talk to one of our character artists, trying to figure out like what are the rules that you're using? Like clearly the artist has certain rules in their head that they're using to make something, and I was like, I want to find out what those rules are and then make them into a toy that's fun to touch. So when the player comes in, they just have this toy they're playing with, and it's making all this good-looking stuff because the toy represents what makes a good creature. So this is an experiment about thinking about some of those artist rules for making creature bodies. It turns out that all creature bodies that a cartoonist would make are like these bean shapes.
Yeah, and usually when you learn to draw a cartoon character, it's like first you draw the circles and you connect them with curves. And so, again, this is kind of deconstructing this massive task of how we make basically Maya for a 10-year-old down to very constituent design problems. How do we do the torso? How do we do the parts plug-in? How do we manipulate the camera? And solving those kind of individually.
And here's another one of the biggest challenges was the 2D versus 3D thing. And actually, I had to learn this trial by fire. I had to learn how to do some 3D programming to get to this point. But it was like when a mouse is a 2D pointer and you don't really know how far